Good morning, it's Jeffrey Christian from CPM Group in New York. It's about 9:40 on Friday, the 29th of October. Moving toward Halloween and the beginning of November. I wanted to talk today about new energy vehicles. When we talk about electric vehicles and the future of propulsion technology, we use the term new energy vehicles because of uncertainties as to the future of propulsion technology and their potential impact on metals. The slides I have are almost exclusively excerpted from a presentation I gave on new energy vehicles and their impact on metals back in July. There's one, I think there's one slide that I've added since then. But we have received good feedback and questions about our opinions, analyses, and projections about electric vehicles and electric vehicle market shares and future energy sources and the impact of future motive propulsion technologies on metals, platinum group metals. Are they redundant? No. Lithium, manganese. We're doing a lot of manganese research, focusing primarily on high purity manganese metal and manganese sulfate, which are used in the battery industry. And that's something we actually have done for about 10 years. I'll just jump a little bit ahead here. We've been doing research on electric vehicles since the 1970s. In 1978, I wrote a newsletter on electric vehicle energy. After the first energy crisis in 1973, 74, we created the Department of Energy. Didn't exist before that. Actually, we first created an Office of Energy Policy within the White House, and we had an energy czar. Didn't have a good czarist-like uniform. He just wore a business suit. And then we created the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy, as well as governments around the world, were throwing hundreds of millions of dollars into alternative energy technologies, electric vehicles, solar power, wind power, sea current power, wave power, all sorts of things. And I had started off in 1975 looking at oil and gas, as well as other commodities, while still in university. And then I got into alternative energy technologies. Wrote a newsletter for a year, or less than a year, on electric vehicle industry, which was sucking it from the Department of Energy, tremendous amount of money. And then I pulled together a book on it in 1979, which was published. Well, it came out in 79, but it had a 1980 publications date, and something of a collector's item. So we've been looking at electric vehicle technology for almost half a century. And we've been looking at, like, for example, manganese and manganese use and manganese sulfate use in batteries for probably more than a decade now. And it's very funny because, Tesla and Volkswagen and Stellantis have all come out and said they're pivoting away from cobalt into manganese in lithium-ion batteries. And so now you have people who have held themselves out as experts on electric vehicles and batteries, all of a sudden looking at manganese where they had ignored it until this year. But we've been looking at it for a long time. And then obviously we've been looking at platinum group metals since the 1970s. So we've received a lot of good feedback on that, and I wanted to talk about it. First, to answer some of the questions that have been raised, to elaborate on some of the points that we've made, and the timing is propitious. CPM Group right now is updating our projections for platinum group metals use in autos, as well as platinum group metals, overall fabrication demand, supply, secondary recovery, and prices. And we're taking those projections out to 2050, which is something we've actually done since 2017. For most metals, we take our long-term projections out 10 years, but because of the uncertainties surrounding future propulsion technologies, we're taking the projections for our auto production and sales, electric vehicles, electric vehicle production, sales, and market share, fuel cell vehicles, other issues out to 2050, because of the fact that these things are not going to be resolved by 2025. they're not going to be resolved by 2030. If the world is lucky, they may even be more unsettled by 2025 and 2030. And I say that just to jump in. Well, I'll get back to that in a second. But, so that's what I really want to talk about. I will say this because there are some people who they oversimplify our view. CPM Group are EV realists. We're not EV skeptics. There are people who see things black and white. If you believe that the US government should be financing highways, you're clearly a communist. No, the world is a spectrum, and it's a spectrum of views. And we're very realistic. We do think that electric vehicles are going to take a lot of market share over the next 10 or 20 years. We're just not as, we think the growth in market share will be much slower than a lot of people say. And I'll explain why. We also think that electric vehicles may well be an interim technology as they were 120 years ago. In 1900, most of the cars being built were electric vehicles, electric cars fueled by lead acid batteries. Gasoline came along, well, first kerosene and then gasoline came along and pretty much displaced electricity. But we think that electric vehicles will take a lot of market share over the next 10, 20 years, but they may actually be an interim technology on the way to something else. And I'll talk about that. We'll see. The future of automotive propulsion technology is what matters. It's not necessarily ICE engines versus EVs in the long run. And the future sources of energy are very important. And they're very important because they key into the issue of where you're going to get your electricity and what does that really do for carbon dioxide emissions, and what does that do about opening the electric vehicle market up for some consumer dissatisfaction and negative reactions when people realize that electric vehicles don't necessarily reduce the amount of carbon dioxide being produced by automotive transportation. And it doesn't necessarily help climate change issues. If you look at electric vehicles, we have very sharp increase in sales last year and this year. Half of the electric vehicles are being sold in China, and they're being bought because the Chinese government says buy electric vehicles. The other half are being bought by people primarily in Europe, but also to some extent in North America, who are very much worried about climate change. And they see this as a way of reducing carbon dioxide emissions. But when you look at the carbon dioxide that's produced in mining lithium, producing lithium ion batteries, and generating the electricity to power electric vehicles, you see that electric vehicles have some environmental benefits, but they don't necessarily reduce carbon dioxide emissions, which is really the key for reducing global warming and climate change. There are half of the people who are buying electric cars right now are buying them because they think they're being good to fight global warming. And when they realize or come to be told that that's not necessarily the case, there could be a backlash to electric vehicles. The same way that you saw a backlash to diesel vehicles, which went from 14% market share to 54% market share in Europe, when the EU government said, oh, diesel fuel somehow or other is cleaner than petrol, gasoline. And then 10 years ago said, oh, we were wrong. Diesel's actually much worse, both for climate change and for public health. So we're getting rid of all of those subsidies. So there are a lot of uncertainties there. And I think that that's really, the key to our analysis. And it's the reason why we see ourselves as being more cautious than others. The uncertainty is the key. And what we always tell people is you have to listen to independent, non-conflicted, knowledgeable authorities. We use a lot of data from the International Energy Agency. That is an international, intergovernmental organization that is chartered with trying to understand past, current, and future energy consumption trends in the world. They're not charged with promoting lithium or cobalt or rare earths or other metals. They are independent and they're paid to be right. And we use a lot of their data. They came out last week with their 2021 global international energy outlook, which I complained to my wife. I said, you know, back 10 years ago, this thing was probably 150 pages long. I think this year it's 368 pages long or something. So it's gotten more important. And you don't listen to politicians and corporate chieftains who are speaking about aspirational goals. And I think I've said this in previous videos. You know, you go to an auto company and the CEO will be saying, well, we hope to have half of our fleet electric by 2030 and all of it electric by 2035. And then you talk to the corporate development and the engineering and the procurement people, and they say, there's no way we can meet those goals. Yeah, we'll be lucky if we get to 25% by 2030 and 35% by 2035. So there's a great deal of uncertainty, and there's a hierarchy. The first one is, what will be the motive power of the future? And the answer is most likely it's going to be a mix. There's going to be ICE, internal combustion engines, that burn diesel and burn gasoline. And they're going to be around for at least the next 30 years, despite what politicians and others say. And there's going to be electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, and there'll be a few fuel cell vehicles. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And there might be other technologies that we're not even focusing on, or that the world's not really focusing on in the long run. And so there's a lot of uncertainty as to what motive power technology will win in the long run. The second thing is, if it is electric vehicles, and for the next 20 years, they seem to have the pole position for taking market share away from ICE engines, which battery technologies will it be? You have sodium ion batteries, you have calcium ion batteries, you have a variety of battery technologies that are under exploration that could supplant lithium ion batteries. And even if it is lithium ion batteries, and it's probably going to be, which technology is it? Is it lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt? Is it lithium manganese? The way some auto companies are saying they see it going? Is it going to be lithium iron phosphorus ones, which all of a sudden are, that technology was sort of poo-pooed for stationary electricity storage systems, but there's been some great breakthroughs in technology, and all of a sudden it looks like what they call LFP, lithium ion batteries, will take that market share as opposed to NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt ones. So you've got all kinds of uncertainties there. And that actually factors into one of the limitations. You know, there's an old joke about a physicist, a chemist, and an economist, and they're on a ship, the ship goes down, and the three of them get into a lifeboat, and there are cans of food, but no can opener. And the physicist says, well, I can use my glasses and I can hold it up between the sun and the can until the can expands and explodes, and then we can get at the food. And the chemist says, well, we can hold the cans in the water, and the salt water will ultimately eat into the metal and we can get into them. And the economist says, well, we could assume that we have a can opener. Joke, but it's a telling joke. And in this month's International Energy Agency report, there's this one line that just tells you everything you need to know. We have assessed the economic potential of EVs, different road vehicle segments, because that's very important, at a regional level, period. Ignoring non-economic barriers, we estimate, you know, that there's enough electricity, assume that the grid is stable, and assume that the capital is provided to all of those privately owned and small public original equipment manufacturers that supply all of the components, starting with the lithium and the rare earths, the manganese, the cobalt, and then proceeding to the cobalt site, high purity cobalt, nickel, and manganese sulfates, and then to the battery manufacturing, and then to the component manufacturers than the connector manufacturers and the motor manufacturers and everybody else, who are all starved for capital right now. And one of the problems with that starvation is that uncertainty. What kind of motor are you going to use? You're going to rely on rare earth magnets in your motors because rare earths are 90% produced in China right now? Are we going to support economically unsupportable rare earth mines to be opened or reopened in the United States and other countries to get to the rare earths? Or are we going to redesign the engines, the motors, and use different batteries that don't use rare earths? Oh, we'll lose some of the efficiency of those motors, but we don't have to worry about being unable to get the rare earths. So there's a lot of uncertainties there about which technology is going to be used, which is one of the reasons why you're having capital capital starvation of the OEM manufacturers. All of that is going to slow the market share growth of electric vehicles. People say, oh, you guys are overblowing the grid instability. Well, at least 3 of the 4 largest states in the United States, Texas, California, and New York, have had major problems with grid instability. New Jersey has. This week, we had a storm in Massachusetts, which knocked out 250,000 households' electricity. And 2 to 3 days later, after the storm, they were still without electricity. And then we won't even talk about Florida. But the reality is, the most industrialized country in the world, you have enormous grid instability at the current level. Forget the idea that you're also going to be producing somehow all this extra electricity. And that's where I'm going to end this presentation. Forget that you're going to be producing more electricity and distributing more electricity to vehicles in a stable grid, in a grid that's not stable enough to handle the current load. So you have this massive problem. And we'll get to the sources of that electricity in a second. Well, maybe not a second. So that is, you cannot ignore those non-economic barriers. So yes, there are all kinds of uncertainties. Which technology will win? Define winning. Electric vehicles may win in the 20s and 30s and lose in the 40s. They could be replaced by hydrogen engines, which is something that I find really interesting. What are the realistic projections for electric vehicles and other new energy vehicles market penetration rates? What's the capital required for that? Limitations in electricity supply, the grid, capital requirements for that, battery technology, demand for lithium, manganese, cobalt, all shift, they are shifting. We've already seen cobalt projections of future cobalt use cut by 33% and then 50%. And a lot of people are talking about cobalt-free lithium-ion batteries now. So all of that investment in these long-dated exploration and pre-development projects on cobalt probably will never see profitable returns. And investors know that, and so they're very hesitant to do that. Demand for other metals. People have now started looking at nickel and copper and saying, okay, if we do have significant market penetration of electric vehicles and electrification in general, we're going to need a lot more nickel, we're going to need a lot more copper. It's there, but it's going to take a lot of capital and time to get to. Platinum group metals, thing that we're studying, that we've been studying all along, people have written off platinum group metals. Well, we're going to go to electric vehicles, so we're not going to have internal combustion engines burning petroleum products, so we're not going to need platinum group metals to clean up the exhaust. Therefore, why invest in platinum group metals mining? Well, if you look at reasonable projections, and the IEA, I think, says maybe about 22% of the cars by 2030 being produced and sold in the world, light-duty vehicles, not cars, but light-duty vehicles, about 22%, I think they're saying, will be electric, which means that you're still going to have 78% burning fuel. And that 22% includes hybrids, which also will burn fuel, which will need PGMs. Our projections are about 16% by 2030 and rising between then and 2050. But you still, by 2050, will have virtually half of the vehicles in the world burning petroleum and needing platinum group metals to clean up the exhaust. And the platinum mining industry has been starved for capital, partly because people say, well, we're not going to need PGMs and autocatalysts anymore, which is wrong. So you're going to get into a situation where you've already seen palladium prices go from 180 to 2,000, 4,000 down to $1,800 or whatever they are now. And you've seen rhodium prices go to $30,000 back down to about $14,000. Now, you've already seen that tightness reflected in high metal prices. Platinum has gone from 800, 900 to 1,200. It's back down to about 1,000. But you can say on a long-term basis, there's not going to be enough PGMs, and it's going to have a severe upward pressure on prices. The same way that you can say that about high purity manganese sulfate, not necessarily manganese ore, because 90% of manganese is used in steel and not in high purity manganese sulfate used in batteries. Uranium, very important because of the question, where are you going to get your electricity? Lithium and cobalt, we've already seen them go high on hype and then come back down. Same with rare earths. So there's this tremendous amount of uncertainty. Fuel cells, these big bars are the amount of platinum that the platinum industry has said would be used in fuel cells. Starting back, if you go back to 1980, they were saying that by 1988, we'd use 340,000 ounces. And you can see every year since then, it's like, okay, no, we're going to use 500, no, 400, no, 600, no, 500, no, 350. And we've never lived up to that. Fuel cells don't make sense technically. They're very complex. They're getting much better. They don't make sense economically for road transportation. They make a tremendous amount of sense when you start talking about stationary power supplies and fleets, intercity buses, airports, warehouses, where you have a fleet manager who's handling a whole bunch of vehicles, and he can safely refuel these things with hydrogen. But even if you have the hydrogen, it may not be fuel cells. And even if you have fuel cells, they may not use platinum. So it's not there. Now, some people have said, oh, well, electric vehicles have won, you can write off hydrogen. And those people tend to think in terms of fuel cells. We say, watch out for hydrogen engines. And that's very important, because if you can get that hydrogen safely and cheaply to consumers, shipped, stored, and distributed to consumers, then you can use it in fuel cells more readily, and you can use it in hydrogen engines. And fuel cells are technically and economically expensive and complex, and hydrogen engines are technologically and economically easy, simple, and cheap. So the platinum industry will say, hey, if we can use liquid organic hydrogen carriers and get hydrogen distributed using LOHC technology, using the existing gasoline and diesel shipping, storing, and distribution chain, then people will use fuel cells. The auto industry says, if you can give me hydrogen at the pump cheaply and safely, I will use hydrogen engines. I'll reduce my capital costs of building engines. I'll reduce my maintenance and operating costs of the engines, fewer parts, more simple technology, going back to 1806. So hydrogen engine, I wouldn't write off hydrogen in the long run. The key is getting the hydrogen safely and cheaply distributed. And I believe the key there is LOHC. And that LOHC technology is a long way away, it looks. So it's not going to interrupt EVs gaining market share for the next 5 or 10 years. But in the next 20 or 30 years, it may well actually start doing that. There's a whole nother question, which I'm not even addressing, which is peak auto. There are people who think that we have sold as many cars and trucks, light duty vehicles, as we ever will, either this year or last year or 2019 or 2022. CPM Group's projections and other people's projections are that we are not anywhere near peak auto, and that auto production and sales will fluctuate with economic things. They'll fall during recessions, and there will be recessions. And over the next 30 years, you might have another 3 recessions. In our long-term projections, that's what we built into our 30 years, 3 more recessions. But probably you're still going to see growth. Yes, you're seeing a mature market in Europe and North America, but you're still seeing a lot of people who would like to have vehicles and own vehicles and use vehicles in the rest of the world, where 6/7 of the population live. So we don't see peak autos there, and we don't see fuel cells being particularly big. But my last 2 charts are the interesting ones. These are projections. You can see you might not be able to see 2019, 2030, and 2040. This is from the International Energy Agency, and this is where power will come from by 2040. You can see oil, petroleum, still is increasing. The world will be using oil in 2040. So say the independent, honest experts, non-biased, unconflicted experts say, we will be using more oil in 2040 than we are today. We'll be using more natural gas. Coal will decline, but will still be the 3rd largest source of energy in 2040, right? All other renewables are way down there, those green balls. Growing sharply, but still the smallest thing. Bioenergy growing, nuclear growing slightly, not necessarily there. Hydro, there's only so much water. Hydrocarbons, these are IEA projections from a different report that came out in June, and these go out to 2050. And the green line is renewables, and you can see renewables actually supplant coal as the 3rd largest source of energy by 2050. They cross around 2040, a little after 2040. And this is all other renewables. So this includes hydro and other things there. So we're still going to be using hydrocarbons for a long time to come. And we're still going to have climate change problems for a long time to come. On Halloween, COP26 starts in Glasgow. And one of the things we'll be watching for is, do the governments capitulate and say, look, we're failing miserably at climate change suppression. So what we have to do is start focusing on how do we prepare our countries, our societies, our buildings, our infrastructure to live with climate change. Air, water, break walls at the ocean and things like that. Because the future for the next 30 years is still going to be very heavily dependent on hydrocarbons. It's just a natural reality there. When I wrote World Guide to Battery Powered Road Transportation, it came out in 1980, one of the reviewers said that I was a shill for the uranium, the nuclear power industry, which is funny because I wasn't. In fact, in 1979, 1978, it was easy to be pro-nuclear power and anti-nuclear power industry, given 3 Mile Island and some other things. And I won't bore you with the stories of Chernobyl and where I was at that time. But the reality is that the guy, that fellow who wrote that and called me a shill of the uranium industry, in the Audis, wrote an article and said I was wrong about nuclear power. Nuclear power is probably the best environmental solution to the world's growing need for electricity. And nuclear power has improved dramatically since the 70s and 80s. And it's very interesting because if you look at the United States, we haven't built a new nuclear power plant since the 1970s. And most of those nuclear power plants ostensibly are way past their useful end of their life. But most of them have been retrofitted so that even though the United States produces far more electricity today than it did in 1980, and we haven't built any new nuclear power plants, nuclear represents a much larger portion of our electricity generating capacity than it did in 1980. So I think nuclear power has been overlooked and berated, and it's been, had a lot of negative comments based on its history, which has been bad, but nuclear technology has improved dramatically. And there's a lot of other things that could happen if the politicians got out of their way. France primarily uses nuclear power. They have a tremendous nuclear power industry that is the envy of the world. And one of the things they do is they recycle spent nuclear fuel. So you don't actually even need new uranium mines. Sorry, I actually own some uranium mines. I'm sorry to the CEOs to say that. But if the United States adopted the same legal policies that France does, we could have plenty of uranium for safer nuclear power plants than we would need. But politicians have a way of getting in the way. I think I've probably gone on longer than I wanted to, and I apologize for those people who look for market outlooks for gold and silver in these videos. I'll just say it's more of the same for the next week or two. We've seen gold and silver trading in a range. They've tested the high, and they've come back off. They'll probably go down and test the lows, and then they'll come back off. We see gold and silver remaining range bound in the near term. So that's our market outlook for precious metals for those of you who really want them. And then if you're interested in our long-term outlook for PGMs, contact us at info@CPM Group, and we'll start talking to you about that. Thank you. Have a good Halloween. I know I will. It's one of my favorite holidays. I'm not quite sure what I'll go as because most of the costumes that you can think of could get yourself shot these days in America. But be safe, be warm, be dry, and have a happy Halloween. I'll talk to you next week.